to help her tend to the king. Over the body, she told Servius that nothing could be done for Tarquin, but that it was imperative the men responsible for the crime should not sit on the throne. She implored Servius to take part in a charade to guarantee that neither of Ancus's sons would ever be king. Throwing open a window and addressing the crowd that had by this time gathered, Tanaquil told them that her husband's wound was only superficial and that the king would be back on his feet soon. In the meantime, she told them to obey Servius, who would act as king until Tarquin could resume his duties. At this point, of course, the king was already dead. Tarquin reigned 37 years and died in 579 BC. Servius performed the duties of king for a time as if he was merely acting in Tarquin's stead, going so far as to reserve judgment in some legal disputes, claiming that he must consult with the king. The sons of Ancus, believing their plot had failed and seeing Servius secure on the throne, went into exile. Not back on Rome, and Servius marched to meet them. Completely destroying the Viad army, Servius returned to Rome a beloved savior. At this point, clearly in command of the throne, the death of Tarquin was announced. No one questioned Servius's continued reign as king, and the plan hatched by Tanaquil was brought to a successful conclusion. Servius would be the second to last king of Rome, and by all accounts the last good one. He was responsible for the final reconfiguration of Roman society prior to the establishment of the Republic, a reconfiguration that would have a profound effect on the way that republic would ultimately be governed. Desiring to take stock of the city's resources, wealth, and population, he instituted the first census. Based upon the data he received, he divided landowning Romans, known as assidui, into 5 classes. Nominally divided by wealth, the idea was to establish who could provide what when war inevitably came knocking. The first class was the richest, able to provide a helmet, round shield, bronze breastplate, leg armor, sword, and spear. The second class provided all the same equipment as the first, save for the breastplate. The third provided the same as the second, but for the leg armor. Only a spear and javelin were required of the fourth class, and the fifth provided merely slings and stones. Sandwiching these classes were the richest of the rich, already separately designated as equites, cavalrymen able to provide horses, and the poorest of the poor, i.e. most of the population, who were exempted from military service. Men aged 18 to 40 from the 5 classes formed the legions, when the need, which was often, arose. The classes did not serve a strictly military function. They also formed the basis of the new Roman electoral college. The old tribal assembly created by Romulus, the Comita Curiata, was surpassed by Servius's new Comita Centuriata. Each of the classes were further divided into centuries which voted as blocks. The centuries, however, were not equal in size. The first class, which was the smallest, was divided into 80 centuries. The second, third, and fourth classes each had 20. The fifth, by far the largest, was composed of 30. The small group of equites were divided into 12 centuries, and the landless masses were granted just 1. Elections being determined by a simple majority, the equites in the first class held between them all the votes they needed to control who would hold office and what policies would be pursued. There was some logic to the wildly skewed voting system. The wealthy shouldered the financial burdens of both state and military, and thus felt entirely justified in their stranglehold on power. The bulk of the population, however, would come to view the system as entirely unjust and would eventually have to take drastic steps for their voices to be heard. Servius's reign was progressing nicely. The Latin communities even contributed funds to build a temple to Diana in Rome, admitting once and for all that Rome was the capital of Latium. However, all was not well. Just as Ancus's sons were the undoing of Tarquin, so would the sons of Tarquin be the undoing of Servius. Servius believed he had covered this obvious threat by marrying his daughters to the 2 Tarquin boys, Lucius and Aruns. But this was not enough for Lucius, who felt he had been tricked out of his rightful succession, though his new wife was non-committal about this alleged injustice. His brother Aruns, who could not have cared one way or the other, found himself married to a woman, Tullia, who resented his lack of ambition and admired Lucius's drive. Tullia further despised her own sister for not supporting an obviously great man in his quest for the throne. Evil took hold of them, and, not being particularly creative, they decided to simply kill their unwanted mates so they could be together and pursue the crown at full throttle. The newlyweds began a whisper campaign against Servius, pointing out his low birth and the fact that he had never been truly elected. To the richest in Rome, they alleged that the census was no more than a trick to expose their wealth so Servius could snatch it up and hand it over to his low-born friends. Lucius grew ever more bold as he gained support, until finally he decided to make his move. He went to the palace while Servius was away and sat upon the throne, demanding that the Senate assemble before him. When they did, out of a mixture of fear and confusion, he demanded they kneel before him and hail him King Tarquin. He was in the midst of a lengthy speech degrading Servius when the old king appeared, demanding an explanation. A scuffle ensued between the supporters of Tarquin and those loyal to Servius, and in the melee, the old king himself was struck and killed. Servius had reigned 43 years and died in 535 BC. Lucius would become known to history as Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome. From the start, Tarquin was the very model of a tyrant. He was vain, arrogant, pompous, and dismissive of both the people and the Senate. He built monuments to himself at the expense of the rich, using the labor of the poor. Smart enough to understand his shaky position, having seized power without so much as a nod to electoral formalities, he chose fear as the basis for his reign. He claimed for himself all legislative and judicial functions and dared anyone to oppose him. Those who did quickly regretted their choice. Tarquin arrested, tried, and executed his opponents, completely bypassing the traditional court system. He confiscated property whenever he saw fit and arbitrarily reduced the ranks of the Senate, leaving it anemic and unable to counter his actions. Tarquin's misconduct was not confined to the city itself. He sought to consolidate Rome's power over Latium, and to this end called a council of the local nobility. He let them sit all day without making an appearance until one of them rose to declare that Tarquin was making them wait on purpose to show that he could order them around at will. Just then Tarquin finally appeared. The king made note of the man who had spoken against him and, after the meeting broke up, bribed one of the noble's slaves to plant a cache of weapons in his master's room. The deed done, Tarquin recalled the council and announced that he had just discovered a plot against his life and fingered the offensive noble as its leader. They marched as a group to where the noble was staying and discovered the hidden weapons. That, coupled with his speech from the day before, was enough to frame the poor man, and he was immediately executed without so much as a trial. The remaining Latin nobility, whether they believed the charges or not, believed that Tarquin was capable of almost anything, and so did nothing to challenge his position in Rome. The city and surrounding countryside thus pacified, Tarquin sat back to enjoy the fruits of his labor. But only poisoned fruit can grow from such poisonous seeds, and Tarquin would soon pay the ultimate price for his underhanded tactics. Tarquin, obviously, had engendered no goodwill in the city, and the population waited only for a spark to light them into full revolt. Tarquin's own son would provide that spark. The young man, Sextus, was invited to a dinner, and upon meeting Lucretia, the lady of the house, Sextus decided that he must have her. Inflamed with lust, he returned to the house while Collatinus was off laying siege to the nearby town of Ardea and raped her. His lust sated, Sextus rode off unaware of what he had set in motion. Collatinus, riding back to Rome with a certain Lucius Junius Brutus, was met by a messenger who bid him return to his house at once. There, surrounded by her father, Collatinus and Brutus, Lucretia told him what Sextus had done, and then, overwhelmed by shame, grabbed a knife and stabbed herself in the heart. The three men, grief-stricken, stood over her body and swore that the Tarquins would pay for her death. Returning at once to the encamped army at Ardea, Brutus raised them into revolt with a stirring speech denouncing the Tarquins as oppressive criminals. He then led the army back to Rome, where he planned to expel the Tarquins once and for all. Arriving in the city, he marched through the streets and found a population slaving away on Tarquin's various pet projects and ready for revolution. Tarquin, at this point, having heard of the mutiny in Ardea, had ridden out to take control of the situation, but instead found his army gone and himself in exile from the city he allegedly ruled. Tarquinius Superbus reigned 24 years and would die seeking, but never regaining, the throne. Back in the city, the liberated people declared the Tarquins enemies of the state and forever barred them from Rome. The Comita Centuriata was convened, and it was decided the king should never again rule Rome, and that two men should be elected annually to be leaders, so the power could never again be concentrated in the hands of a single man. Collatinus and Brutus were duly elected and were inaugurated as the first two consuls in Roman history. The year was 509 BC, and the most famous republic in the history of the world was born. The story of the ill-fated Tarquin dynasty casts an interesting shadow over Roman history. Through the obviously apocryphal royal biographies, a general outline of actual history begins to emerge. As I said in part 1, Roman culture was derived largely from Etruscan and Greek influences, so, as an instructive parallel, we are given the story of a family of kings who became masters of Rome after emigrating from Etruria and were descended from an exiled Greek. There, in the micro story of the Tarquins, is the macro story of all Rome. This dramatic, if fictitious account has roots in reality. Modern historians recognize the dominance Etruria had over Rome until the founding of the Republic. It is thought that Etruscan kings did indeed command Rome, and that they were rejected by a native population wary of their rule. Though the neatness of this account no doubt misses a reality filled with intermarriage and colliding cultures, making it hard to know who was a native Roman and who was a foreign Etruscan. The story of the kings also offers a moral that the Romans followed to great success and abandoned at their peril. Until the ill-fated Tarquinius Superbus, none of the kings had been the son of a previous ruler. Hereditary succession played almost no part in the ascension of the kings. Ancus Marcius was the only one who was even related to one of his predecessors, and he was the grandson of Numa, not an immediate heir. This stands in stark contrast to the monarchies that emerged in the Middle Ages that were founded entirely on the passing of power from father to son, whatever the merits or abilities of the child. Gibbon famously marks the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, with Marcus Aurelius' sentimental choice of his son Commodus and not another, more capable man to succeed the imperium in 177 AD. The choice ended 5 successive transfers of power from the emperor to a man chosen on merit and not relation. The 100-year period of the so-called 5 good emperors marked the height of Roman power, wealth, and stability. History has shown again and again that the ship of state is well sailed when leadership is based on great ability, and run against the rocks when it is based upon mere birth. The Roman monarchy was now dead, never to return. Next, we move on to the story of the Roman Republic, and trace its long march through the Italian peninsula, across the Mediterranean, and into legend. Next week we will discuss the first days of the Republic, who its initial leaders were, and what would happen to any man who ever again tried to make himself king of Rome. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. It had been 200 years since the founding of Rome, and since that time the Romans had undergone a massive transformation. In the beginning, they were a collection of pastoral herdsmen and unsavory cast-offs making their way in the world by flock and trade, and since that time they had learned to become settled farmers, tilling the land and raising crops. They had gone from being a collection of armed rabble to a society of laws with a well-equipped, well-disciplined army. They had gone from upstart village to regional capital and now stood ready to challenge a wider pool of neighbors for control of all Italy. The Etruscans lay to the north and the Greeks to the south, and having conquered the central lowlands during the reign of the kings, the Romans now turned to the hills and mountains of East Italy for fresh conquests and, as always, were forced to parry the thrust of the Etruscan cities to the north. This is the world into which the Republic was born. According to the legendary chronology, the kings were overthrown in 509 BC, though the date is highly suspect. Most likely later, patriotic Roman historians changed the timing of the event to slightly predate the establishment of democracy in Athens by Cleisthenes in 508 BC. The Romans had a hard time believing they were not first and best in everything, especially in the democracy they took so much pride in, so they altered their history to outdo the Greeks. However, without any concrete data,